Good morning. This is the Community and Economic Development Committee meeting of the Anchorage Assembly. Today is Thursday, December 5th. It's just after 9 a.m. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order and start with member introductions. I'm Scott Myers, Vice Chair, and we'll go around and have the members introduce themselves.
Hi,
Randy
Anna
Schultz.
Brawley.
Randy Schultz here.
Mark Littlefield.
Steve Owens.
Zach Johnson.
Karen Bronga.
Perfect. I believe that is all the members I see online now. So we'll go ahead and just start with regular reports. Office of Economic and Community Development, Building Services. Lance, do you want to take that one away?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Scott. I'll keep my report brief. I know that we've got some other departments on, and I know a couple others are going to be joining. I think for us, and I didn't see Tiffany on here, but we've got a couple things going on, and I'll let the departments bring them up. But for the group, Assemblymember Zalatel and another assembly member had some interest in updating Title 15, which has to do with how we regulate wells and working with development services and the DEC. And we're looking to get that introduced in January. So you should be looking for something like that. And if Daniel King's on, he can give you an update. We are putting, I think, the final touches on a RFP for the archives property. We want to make sure that we're working, because we know the assembly is interested in some potential tax abatement policies. So we want to be able to time that with them. And so we're working with a couple of assembly members on working through that. And then as we've approved, my last topic here and is that we've approved the budget. Maybe this is for Mandy the most, but our title for community development will be changed. It'll be planning, development, and public works. And so, which I think is pretty appropriate for what we do over here. And I think with that, I'll summarize unless have any members have any questions. And if we get back with the departments and you have a question and you get through them, I'll be able to address them. So thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Lance. Tiffany, I do see is online, but I see member Brawley has a question first. Anna, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, just briefly, I wondered if there was an update on the status of the review of Title 23, the building code, and updating to IBC 2024.
Yeah, hang on there, and I'm going to see if Daniel's on.
I am on, yes.
Thanks, Daniel.
So we've got our meetings have actually started this week for all of the code committees. We've had our kickoff meeting for structural, non-structural, and fire code. And then tomorrow we'll be doing mechanical code. These are the kickoff meetings just to set a schedule and start assigning chapters. So it has begun. Is that the kind of update you were looking for, Anna?
Yeah, thanks. I was just curious where it was. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Dan, you want to just
Lance.
keep going on development services, see what's going and give them an update on some other topics there?
Sure. Yeah. So we have things are slowing down now that's heading into winter, but we're still on track to match our budget from last year, which is great. We've been working a lot with planning and zoning and property appraisal to make sure that we're coordinating on all of our efforts, which is really nice. We've done some updates to the shelter units policy as well, so that will be going out and make things easier for people to do the shelter units from that from the AO on that. The well code as well should be going in January to the assembly for you guys to see. It is currently with legal for their final pass through, but the tech board on-site well and septic has reviewed it and approved what we've got.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah.
I had a quick question if I could bounce in.
Go ahead, member Bronga.
Daniel, Brandy was talking to me last night about the shelter, and I didn't really understand her, but she was saying that what you're doing with the shelters, they have to be a certain size that is really small, and she'd like to do shelter units that are larger, and I didn't really understand what she meant. I didn't think we had prescribed that they had to be only, 5 foot by something. I thought that was the lower limit.
We have put a limit on the size of those. The AO in the code specifically says that sleeping units can only be 120 square feet. They cannot be any larger. And community units can be up to 400 square feet. A previous version of that code section that was put out last year had them at 100 feet and 800 feet. And the update that happened this year changed it. So instead of 100, it's 120, and it actually reduced the community units from 800 down to 400. So that is specific language that was put in that assembly ordinance to limit the size on these. Part of the intent, I believe, is because they are getting exempted from building review, so they won't get an architectural review, they won't get a structural review, and they don't have permanent construction, is that they're trying to be kept small so that if they get if they need to be removed, it's easy to remove them. And if they have a large snow load, smaller structures tend to do better. And they are supposed to clear the snow off. So when you get much larger structures, you're going to have a hard time clearing the snow off of the roof. They only are required by that ordinance to be able to support 20 pounds per square foot, and our design snow load in Anchorage is 40 pounds per square foot. So it is required that they are able to access and clear the roofs off. If you get much larger, a 400 square foot unit could be basically 20 foot by 20 foot. That's going to be difficult to clear. If you allow them to build something larger, they're not going to be able to clear it without climbing on top of the roofs. And it's going to make it harder for them to do that safely. And there's no procedure in place for them to be required to have a clearing maintenance person. So that would put a lot of people at risk. So I believe that was the intent, is to try and keep them small and safe.
Yeah, I really appreciate you clarifying that, and that does make sense. So
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I'll pivot back to Lance and find out if he had anything else he wanted to give us an update on.
I do not, thank you.
Okay, did you cover planning department as well as development services?
I think I'm going to let Melissa handle the planning department. I believe she's online.
Perfect.
Good morning. For the planning department this morning, current planning, there was an assembly work session that was held for the Girdwood Comprehensive Plan, and there will be an S version resulting from the work session. The public hearing for this plan is scheduled on the 17th of this month. There is a zoning district's SLAO before, there was an SL before the PZC for a recommendation, and that is going back to the PZC for the recommendation on Monday. There were 2 rezones recommended for approval by PZC at this week's meeting, and we do have a vacancy in current planning for the planning manager at the moment. For zoning and land use review, it's a slow time of year for them. They're spending time refining their research and permit review process to be more efficient, and then organizing files. They're also verifying data for special limitations so that they're easier to access online. For AMATs, there's a technical advisory committee meeting today where they will probably be discussing the Fish Creek Trail project. If anyone would like to join and listen to that session, it should be an interesting meeting. The Title 21 team, they are probably going to start on a AO to update the Title 21 for manufactured housing and where that's permitted or not permitted in the municipality. So that'll be an upcoming discussion. Again, the SL's AO is moving through the PZC and heading to the assembly pretty soon. And then they're also gathering information for an omnibus that we plan on bringing to the PZC and the assembly probably sometime in March. For long range, they just are in the midst of completing the community council boundaries project. And then they are in coordination with the administration on a right-of-way management study and the snow and ice removal strategy. that's what I have for today.
Perfect. Thank you very much. If any members have questions, just shoot me a text message and I'll get you in the queue. We will move on to Public Works, Maintenance and Operations.
Good.
Good morning, everybody. This is Kent Colhays. A handful of things in the M&O world. I think many folks anyway, are aware of the two incidents of water damage at the Chugiak Eagle River Senior Center. The most recent one was 2 weeks ago. The immediate damage has been mitigated and the leaks have been stopped. Our next steps, we're working with purchasing right now as we speak to put together a contract to fix all the rooms that have been damaged. There were 2 damaged 2 weeks ago. There were 5 damaged a month and a week ago. And then there were 2 that were damaged in early July, not through building system failures, but for other reasons. So 11 residents displaced, and we're working, like I said, working with purchasing to get a contract in place to repair all of those rooms as quickly as possible. So if members have questions on those, like try to answer them now, or feel free to reach out to me.
I am wondering, Kent, and I presume you're doing this, but having that entire fire suppression system looked at, since that seems to be the failure point.
Yes, exactly, Scott. It's already in the works. M&O has a term contract with a fire suppression system specialist, and they're reviewing the system. So we'll hopefully figure out what's going on and eliminate it from happening again. I know that would make everybody happy, especially the residents. So.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, thanks, Kent.
In the street maintenance world, they're out today doing sanding and ice suppression. Some good news in that arena. We are in the process of we have already purchased 4 new snow blowers. These are the ones that are loader mounted for loading trucks when we're hauling downtown and arterials and residential areas. 2 of those are set to ship, I think, in the next week, and the other 2 are set to ship before the end of the year. So by January, February, we should have 4 brand new snow blowers online, which would be great. The ones we have now are very old and prone to breakdown. Staying on the snow topic, the mayor and the manager have asked Public Works to convene a working group to look at how snow is managed on sidewalks and pedestrian facilities through Anchorage. So the approach we're taking there is convening a group of representatives from almost every municipal department you can imagine that touches snow. That's PM&E, maintenance and operations, parks and recreation, transit. I'm probably missing somebody. And we've also invited a representative from the school district and representative from Alaska DOT, and they were both very excited when I reached out to them. So we've had an internal working group meeting. The first availability to get the whole group together was next week. And our approach there will be, I think our initial gains can be in the areas of coordination, better coordination, and perhaps some prioritization or reprioritization of where we collectively put our efforts. Everybody knows that nobody has more money, people, or equipment right now to do more of the network. But the next step in that process will be looking at where we can find efficiencies in the future and how we might restaff, re-coordinate up our fleet collectively across the board and provide even better service to the citizens. And for the assembly members on the call, I believe if we make it through OnBase, you should see it just an AIM on that effort for the agenda on the 17th. And then last thing I have is moving to PM&E. There's a couple things going on there. One is Melinda Kohlhaas and Brandon Telford are in the process of updating the DCM, which has not been updated since 2007, I think. And I believe that we'll be bringing maybe a little more detailed update to probably the next transportation committee meeting. And then final thing that I would offer is that in the world of CASA, Chugiak area,
Chugiak Access Service
area, we are convening in another working group. We met a couple weeks ago with Diana Rhodes, a couple folks from the Hillside Community Council, and one of the things we're looking at doing there is developing a methodical process for gathering and evaluating projects, similar to what we do in the ARTSA world for our road projects there. So more to come on that, but we're putting some rigor to that process because there's a lot of need, and we have this bonding authority that really can be beneficial to the public. So that's all I have. Thank you. Glad to answer any questions.
Perfect, Kent. Member Brawley has a question.
Yeah, thanks. Well, first I'll say thanks for the update on this coordinating snow. I think that's great, and that's something that I know we've talked about for a while. So happy to see that happening. And same with CASA. I think that that will be really valuable to really figure out how to create a workable procedure and really help people see kind of how projects are chosen. My question is on the DCM, or I guess maybe a note to follow up. So the site access project reviewing changes to zoning code related to pedestrian access and driveways and things. We're coming up with a lot of good information about things that probably don't belong in zoning code, don't belong in Title 21, but should be addressed. And so I just want to flag that. And I know our staff are tracking that as well, but for the DCM for driveway standards, there's some other pieces where we discovered places for updates. So I just want to mention that. And then kind of specifically for the DCM, what the timeline is for updating that. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. I will make sure that Brandon and Melinda, make themselves aware of the site access questions and the other things you're coming up with. I don't have the schedule at the tip of my fingers right here, but I'll talk to Brandon and perhaps we can send that out. Like I said, if we don't do that, it'll certainly be provided at the next Transportation Committee meeting, but I know that's not till January, so.
Yeah, Assemblyman Myers or Senator Boland, can you remind us when the next Transportation Committee meeting is, or do you know off the top of your head, so we're prepared for that day in December? Or maybe send it to us when you can.
Yeah, I can do
Yeah, Daniel, you take care of that.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
And
Thank you.
sorry, this is Anna. I know it's Wednesday, January 15th, because I was looking at it for something else.
Thank you, Anna.
Member Solt had a question as well.
Thank you. It's more of a comment to Kent that Legislative Services is working on kind of a CASA, CAPSIS, CIP survey for the road service areas. Once we get that compiled, we'll certainly feed that over to you to help feed into your process. Thank you.
Very much appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, unless there's no other questions, we will move on to project management and engineering.
Oh, I think Kent was covering all of the public works departments at one time
Oh.
there.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay,
Yes.
so we'll move on to Tiffany for for real estate.
Good morning. The only other update for real estate is we are working on finishing up the draft HLB work plan for 2025. We hope to get that out by the end of next week. That will start the 45-day public review period. We would like to know if you want us to make a presentation at the next committee meeting, so you can mull that over. We would have a public hearing at HLBAC on February 27th, and then probably be introduced to the assembly sometime either late March or that first meeting in April. That's it for me.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tiffany. We'll move on to ACDA. Anybody's here to give a report on that?
Good morning, everybody. This is Mike Robinson. Thanks for going virtual and letting everybody get on this morning. So not a lot to report today. A couple of things, though. The big news is that the downtown transit hub has reopened in the 6th Avenue parking mall. And excited about that. It's been several months that we've been working with the staff over at Transit to make that happen. And as that happened on Monday, I'm sure many of you probably saw the article in the newspaper. There also, the other news is that the 6th Avenue Development Group did not make their financial close deadline on the development agreement as required. So we terminated the agreement with them, which doesn't terminate any potential for their project, but we had to make sure that we lived up to the terms and conditions that were outlined in the contract for future protection for the city. The staff came back late last night we went to the U.S. Community Development and Housing Summit that was held in California down in Los Angeles. And so that was pretty exciting. We had a chance to talk to a lot of folks that are solving all types of homeless, all types of housing issues across the country. And we hope to incorporate some of those things and hopefully we learned and some things that we'll put into play here over the next several months. Then also, I just wanted to talk about, we are continuing to work with grants and trying to find funding sources. We've been working with the administration to garner the balance of the CDBGR funds that are hanging out. And it looks like that is moving forward pretty nicely, actually. So that's about all I have to report today. Unless there are any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I do not see any members with questions in the queue. We will move on then to unfinished business, continue discussion regarding AO 2024-111, TSDC map. Graham, are you on? You want to take it from there?
Hi, I'll probably pass it over to Melissa to start, if that's all right.
Perfect, that's fine.
Can somebody pull up the slides?
Mandy, could you possibly pull up the slides, or I can also pull them up from here if that'd be easier.
I can do it. Just let me know when you want to change the slides.
Okay, thanks.
So I'm going to go ahead and start as the slides are being pulled up, and I'll try to make this super quick because I know we have a lot to cover today. First of all, I wanted to thank Chair Martinez for bringing this AO forward. The department is really happy that he's taking an important step to implement the 2020 comprehensive plan and the 2040 land use plan. And then I also wanted to give a very quick update or an overview of the AO just for people who are not quite familiar with it. I know there was a previous presentation, so on the left, are the slides up quite yet? Okay, so on the first slide, if we could go back to that. Sorry, we're having technical difficulties here.
Mandy, I'm going to try just sharing them from here, if that's all right.
Yeah, you should be able to do your share. There's no restrictions. Sorry.
All right. Is everybody able to see these?
Yeah, it's on the screen now.
Okay, great. So thank you. On the left, you can see the new map proposed by the AO. And on the right, you can see the transit supportive corridors that are in the land use plan map, in the 2040 land use plan, the map associated with that online. And the map online doesn't quite look like this, but we've distilled it down to only the transit corridors instead of including all of the other comprehensive plan elements. So you can see on the left that portions of the transit corridors have been expanded to include other parts of Muldoon, the Muldoon area. And what the AO does is it divorces the association of sections 1270 with the land use plan map and creates a new map for the tax abatement areas. So basically that just means that the reference for that section would no longer go to the land use plan map. And we do agree that there is a need based on this AO and other conversations recently that there's probably a need for an update to the land use plan map in relation to this AO. And so the map itself is about a decade old. The land use plan map is about a decade old, and due to current economic our current economic situation and our housing crisis, we do think that there is a need for an update. And our initial reaction to the AO itself and the expansion of those tax abatement areas was that our planning policy guidance over the last few decades has focused on targeted investment areas in smaller areas, such as the reinvestment focus areas. So our initial reaction was that this proposal, that maybe the areas outlined for the tax abatement map should be more targeted and should contract and maybe not expand as a strategy for better managing corresponding public investments. However, in considering the performance of some of the past tax abatement efforts, we realized that some of them, like the reinvestment focus areas, have never been used or very rarely used. And in talking with Chair Martinez and Nolan and others, and then listening to the feedback from the public at the assembly meeting on Tuesday, it made me wonder if perhaps we have not cast that net wide enough for it to be effective. So the map still outlines, the proposed map still outlines a constrained area, but it allows slightly more opportunities for the development community to select the properties that work better for their needs, for locations where projects are more likely to pencil out. If the AO is approved, we at planning can still use predictive modeling based on factors such as land value or building age or demographic trends to select target areas to suggest for infrastructure investments in the future. We support the direction of the ordinance and would like to use feedback from the public as this and other efforts related to rezoning and transit supportive development corridors move through the Assembly's process. And we'd like to use that conversation to inform and update the 2040 land use plan map. Once that update is complete, if necessary, we would like to at that time explore reestablishing the connection between 1270 and the land use plan map. But there is also an argument for not reestablishing that connection just to keep the tax abatement map more flexible as other needs arise in the community. So thanks again to Chair Martinez for bringing this ordinance forward, and we're looking forward to working with the community and with the chair on future updates to the land use plan map. Thank you.
Perfect. Graham, do you have anything you want to add? Or I see Dean has a question. Go ahead, Dean, and then Member Solt and Member Brawley have questions as well.
Actually, I would like to go after the members. Maybe they're asking the same questions, so I would defer to them.
Okay, Member Solt, go ahead.
Thank you. I really appreciate this. I support it. I know we originally brought this forward to focus on the Muldoon corridor, which maybe we highlight a little bit, but I do think this map needs expansion. My only ask is, are you looking at trying to forecast and expand? You know, let's do this once, get it right, even though we may not have the corridors completely set up yet, but we can provide benefit. And then will there be any kind of maybe review period to look at this again in the future? I think if we put it everywhere, it minimizes the impact, but we want to make it more complete than it is currently today. Thanks.
Through the chair to Member Solt, I'm sorry, your question broke up just a little bit, but if your question was if there would be, if our update would include more community process and opportunities for input in order to get this right, so that we only have to update the transit corridors and the land use plan once, then yes, absolutely.
Well, the same.
Yeah, part of it's that. Part of it's also, since we represent South Anchorage and we don't have necessarily the bus routes, which is one of the drivers for this, we just want to make sure that, you know, major roadways or areas where this will make sense in the future, although it may not have the full needs today, that we think about whether or not we include those this time. Thank you.
Member
Yeah, I'd also be happy to,
sorry.
if it's useful. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Member Solt. And I think what we're thinking about is actually thinking pretty expansively here. On the one hand, Nolan's proposed tax incentive, which is still being drafted, will be citywide, and the transit corridors would be a bonus area. So we'd have broad coverage, but then an incentive to focus on these zones. And we're thinking that, I think in general, and Melissa can disagree with me if she thinks otherwise, but I think we're on the same page here that increasing the area that this covers means it's going to have the biggest impact, because that's the most likely that we're going to capture someone who wants to make an improvement on their land. We do want to keep it focused on areas where, we want that density and that growth, but that's sort of how we're roughly thinking of things. And the reason I think why we're talking about this today is I asked Member Martinez to delay, and he's very kind in doing so, so that we could figure out about maybe avoiding creating two different maps and two different processes. But I think everyone's on the same page in particular about expanding to Muldoon.
Great, thank you.
Member Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'll just give some comments and just weigh in on the expansion part. And I know we've had traded some emails about this too. I think and I appreciate Graham's point about we're looking at the tax incentive piece, and there's multiple layers to this. I think one thing that I think would be useful in terms of how to prioritize where these areas go, I do support expanding them. I'm less worried about diluting the impact, because really, I think, Graham, you said it already, we really are looking at making it possible for folks to have an opportunity to build. And so the question is, would we, if there's somebody who's interested in a property, is on a transit line, it looks like a good area, would we require them to sell that property and buy a different one if we have these very targeted areas? Because that's really what that would mean, or just the good luck of if you happen to be in one of those small areas. So I just want to offer that for folks to think about. I would like to see a focus, maybe not just on bus routes. And again, I know it's transit corridor, but in terms of how we evaluate where we should be putting denser housing, I think another consideration is things like proximity to commercial uses, proximity to grocery stores, really, thinking about kind of folks who don't have cars, what can they access either on foot or with a short transit ride. And I'm getting to that because I'll disclose, one of my constituents, J.R. Wilcox, owns a property on Diamond and Arlene that we talked about at length at the Housing Summit last year, being on a bus route next to a green belt, next to a grocery store, in a big commercial area, an unbuilt property that is not in one of these transit corridors. And he has a project that he would be interested in building. So I say disclosure because I'm not working for him, but to be clear, he's advocated for that. But I think it's a good example of the type of property where we would want to see development. And on the map, we have said that is not at all an area that we want to highlight because it's west of Minnesota on Diamond. So another area is UMed. Anyway, there's a few areas, but I think we should think not just about bus routes, but kind of where people are going and how they interact day to day. And so proximity to, like I said, commercial areas, grocery stores, job centers, I think is another smart way to look at it in terms of kind of where we're picking these areas. And then my question is, so given that this was postponed to the meeting of December 17th, and I know there was discussion about, needing at least until January, I'm just wondering from the admin folks and planning kind of what your time frame would be. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm happy to, well, go first.
If you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. My thinking first, I think the first thing is important to say is that if this passed at your next meeting, like no harm, this is great. It's good to highlight Muldoon. Muldoon deserves this attention. So you could pass this at your next meeting, and that would be wonderful. That said, I think given that we may be coming back with the tax incentive fixes that Nolan is drafting, and those are still with legal, so they've just been a bit swamped, so we're a little bit delayed there. And then we're also expecting, potentially, have been working with members Salt and Martinez on a related zoning change that Melissa maybe could give an update on timeline of. Those two other pieces could potentially sort of have us redoing some of this work and going through that public process to really flesh out what the map should look like. So there's a chance of some duplicated effort if, and having to sort of come back and make sure there's only one map later, but that's the only reason really for a delay.
Okay, thanks. That makes sense.
Did Melissa have anything she wanted to add to that?
No, I think Graham summed it up. Thank you.
Perfect. Dean, did you still have a question?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, I had two questions, I think. One was on the reinvestment focus areas, and I think Mr. Kenneth Foster said that it hasn't been used, but I understand it's also fairly new. And what I recall sort of vaguely is that, and I asked Mr. Whitfield about this once, it was new in the land use plan update, and then we had an ordinance in 2022 that established a process in code, but we haven't actually, and although we had some list of initial reinvestment focus areas, we haven't actually had one established officially by assembly action. And is that correct? Or I don't want to misstate or misunderstand. I know there were two initial areas to start with in the plan, but yes.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you. Through the chair, this is Daniel McKenna Foster, Long Range Planning. Yeah, Dean, you're absolutely correct. The 2040 plan created this idea of RFAs, and it designated general areas. And a lot of times people look and they say, oh, great, we've got RFAs. There are no formally established RFAs anywhere in the municipality. We did create the process in 2021 or 2022. So it's a completely separate process, goes through assembly approval and all that sort of thing. But none of those processes has ever gone fully. I don't think we've even started one. So the map shows general RFA areas, but yeah, to confirm, there are no established RFAs that have gone through that assembly process in the municipality.
Thanks, you. I mean, that's not to say anything about a lack of progress, but I think it's like there's resource issues in this ordinance that set up the process. I pulled it up. It's AO 2022-62S. I mean, it's only 2 years old, so it's still relatively new, at least in the terms of land use context. I had a second question, and I do understand that the maps in 1270 that we're looking at for AO 2024-111 and the one in the land use plan for these transit supportive corridors may have some differences in some areas, and the 1270 is broader. And I guess my question is, although you may get the tax abatement, if you're not in an area in the land use plan map for transit supportive corridors, what are the benefits that you don't have the advantage of in terms, I guess, your development? Is it like size and bulk, or I don't know, maybe that's too much of a loaded question, but it would be, I guess, helpful to understand what someone getting tax abatement outside of an area that's not in the land use plan map transit supportive area, transit supportive corridor area is missing.
Well, isn't a transit supportive corridor just one potential growth factor in the 2040 land use plan? So Dean, is your question, I guess I don't understand the question.
I think that Title 21 has some certain differences or allowances for development and design if you're within the transit supportive corridor. And then since we're expanding it in 1270, some properties in those larger areas won't have that advantage. And maybe I'm incorrect, but maybe Mr. McKenna Foster has an answer.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you. Through the chair. Again, this is Daniel McKenna Foster, Long Range Planning. Yeah, currently the transit supportive corridors exist on the 2040 land use plan map, but they don't really do much in terms of the actual land use regulation. So the department does use them when we're looking at a rezone. Sometimes the rezone, one of the conditions is if it's in a transit supportive corridor, then you can rezone into a different type of zone. But in terms of the actual entitlements that you get right now, there isn't anything. So you just, if you're an R1 zone lot in a transit supportive corridor, it doesn't really affect you. It doesn't give you anything else or limit you in any way. But so my understanding, Mr. Gates, of your question is that what happens to the people who are in the transit supportive corridor but not in the tax abatement area, as things are, not much, unless maybe they're trying to rezone, and then the planning department would look at that corridor as things stand right now, just as a way to consider different, whether it's an appropriate rezone or not. Whether there's an additional AO that talks about an actual overlay, I think at least there's somebody else could speak to that. But at the moment, transit supportive corridors are sort of a guide that's on the land use plan map, and we use them when we look at rezones if things are appropriate or not. But they don't serve a big function much further than that.
Thank you very much.
Graham, did you have something you wanted to add? Okay.
Nope, I think it's perfectly captured. Thanks.
Mr. Schutte.
Good morning. Thank you. I just wanted to follow a similar line of thought to the comments offered by Assemblymember Brawley. You know, that when thinking about the transit supportive development corridors, it's a little bit of a symbiotic relationship. It's as we develop better transit options, people have the ability to get to and from work or wherever in a different mode of transportation, but we have to put the people near that. And so helping to put more people near our transit lines, I think, should be highlighted as a priority of this effort. And to that point, I do think the map as presented misses several areas that both have existing residential capacity who are primarily going to be bus riders, but also future development opportunity that could further bolster that ridership. And beyond the Diamond and Arlene property that she highlighted, I think we should look more closely at Old Seward. It's one of the only north-south connectors for people who rely on transit. In fact, it's the only one that goes far enough to even begin to touch Assemblymember Salt's district. It also happens to have a really robust commercial corridor that has a lot of residential density already adjacent to it. So those are areas where I could see true benefit from trying to encourage greater residential development. Not the greatest street from a pedestrian standpoint, I understand, but there's a lot of land capacity there. And then similarly, the east-west section of Tudor that gets dropped in the map, I think that's worth highlighting as well. Again, we already have a lot of multifamily properties at that New Seward Tudor intersection area. And I think it's a great way to continue either bolstering those units or encouraging new units in the same neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Member Brawley.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just quickly echo second for Old Seward. I think the other thing to think about is where there's parcels that are big enough to put a significantly sized building or multiple buildings that is one of these higher density projects. And so I think that's another reason to look at this commercial property or kind of legacy industrial land that we have in places like Old Seward, because that's literally where you can fit buildings without having to, assemble multiple small residential lots, which is its own challenge. So anyway, just seconding what Chris just said.
Perfect. If there are no other comments, then we will move on to new business. Discussion regarding AO 2024-99 special limitations. Member Boland in planning. I don't know who wants to take this.
Hey, so I think planning is going to give a presentation.
Thank you, Member Boland. I'm going to try sharing again. Again, this is Daniel McKenna Foster, Long Range Planning. Just want to check, is everybody able to see this slide?
Yes. Daniel, it's on there.
Well, thank you. So the Assembly introduced AO 2024. Looks like I have sorry, this is not 124. It's PZC case number 2024-124. It's AO 2024-99. Sorry about that. So the Assembly introduced this about a month ago, several weeks ago, and the Planning Department has just sort of been looking at it and providing information to the Planning and Zoning Commission. We went to the Planning and Zoning Commission on November 18th, and we're going again on December 9th. So we had a pretty interesting discussion on November 18th. They had a few questions, and so we responded to those. That memo is out. If you look at the packet materials for the December 9th Planning and Zoning meeting, you will find our responses to their questions there. So jumping into it, what are special limitations? Special limitations are sort of a type of special limitation that you can put on a rezone during a rezone process to sort of create a new zone based on a sort of existing base zone. They can do a lot of different things. They can limit density, prohibit structures, prohibit uses, allow certain uses. They can require certain design standards or structures or other site features. They can require compliance with a site plan. They can require construction and installation of improvements, like public improvements, and they can impose time limits for taking subsequent development actions. So we've gone through and looked at a lot of, I think we looked at all of the SLs. There are over 300 of them. Some we're still kind of tracking them down, but just looking at the internal GIS, we've sort of looked at those, put them into an Excel spreadsheet, and we found that most of the SLs that exist out there are B3 SLs. So starting with a B3 zone, and then special limitations were applied to sort of remix the zone, you might say. So these are all the ones that currently exist according to the most accurate records we can find. So it's interesting because over time, SLs seem to have played different purposes. And from our research, it seems that SLs, they've been a pretty important tool in sort of filling in the gaps where regulation wasn't meeting community needs. But over time, a lot of these SLs, or a lot of the things that ended up in SLs, have been incorporated into Title 21. For example, public meetings and site plans reviews are now regulated by 2103 and 2105. You know, back 20, 30 years ago, there weren't a lot of standards like that. So a rezone would happen, the community would say, wait a second, we want to be a little more involved in this, but there was no means in the code to establish that there would be a site plan or a meeting or a review. And over time, that's been incorporated and sort of built into the code. Access requirements, that's another big one. You see a lot of SLs on Muldoon that say no access to Muldoon, you can only take access off DeBar, that sort of thing. And those are also now regulated through site plan reviews and agency comments, right? Like when we have a development, it goes through the muni, we give it to DOT. Sometimes they'll say, this looks great, but please don't take access here, or we can't grant a driveway here. So a lot of that has been incorporated into that process. Design standards and density requirements, some of those have been incorporated into things like the R3A and the R4A zones, which say, you know, the buildings have to be oriented in this way, you have to have a certain density, and that sort of thing. And then slope concerns or other environmental concerns. A lot of those are, as far as we know, all of those are now incorporated into Title 23 building code and zoning reviews, including some stuff that wasn't in SLs that we have stronger rules now, like in terms of avalanches. So I've looked through all the SLs. I haven't seen anything, that doesn't mean it isn't there, but I haven't found anything related to avalanches, but we do not have an avalanche code. And we talked to the Geotechnical Advisory Commission last month and heard from them a little bit, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So sort of supporting this idea that SLs have served a purpose, and now many of those purposes are served through the existing code over time, is if you just look at the date of the ordinance and then you kind of map it out over time. And most, 79 SLs, we aren't quite sure what the date is. We need to go back and do some research. It's going to be a lot of looking at sort of the big paper files we have. You have some in the 70s, but a lot of it starts when the Anchorage Borough, everything merged and we got the municipality of Anchorage. And then in the 80s, you see a lot of SLs. So 131 SLs in the 80s, 60 in the 90s, 58 in the 2000s, 38 in the 2010s, and then 9 in the 2020s. So overall, just in general, SLs are being used less frequently. So there are a lot of problems with SLs in terms of implementation, in terms of access for the public. And so, I've gone through many of them and I've found a lot of really interesting examples, but these are sort of the overall issues that I've come across. And we're also looking at a bigger sort of categorization and coding of how these work so we can classify them a little bit better. But this is just after about 2 weeks of review. SLs, sometimes they refer to code sections that don't exist. They'll refer to 2145, something from old code. So if you're the average property owner and you say, oh, I have this SL, but it refers to this code section that I can't find in the books anymore, that creates sort of an issue where it requires a lot of interpretation. Some, they end up with split lot zoning. So they'll say, this 100-foot strip is industrial with these limitations, and the rest of the property is residential or something like that. Highly variable lists of what is allowed or not allowed. Some SLs say the following 10 uses are permitted, everything else is prohibited. Other SLs will say the following 25 are prohibited and everything else in the zone is permitted. So it creates some inconsistency with people trying to figure out, so do I look at what's allowed or what isn't allowed? That can also make for some interpretation challenges. some case-by-case stipulations. I found one that says packaged liquor stores only allowed if associated with a major retail operation. So packaged liquor is a subsidiary use only. Just thinking through the implementation of that, that would be really complicated, right? Do we have a definition for what a major retail operation is? And I think, you know, many of these were well-intentioned. It was people trying to solve a problem. But when it comes down to applying the code equally and fairly, it just gets a little bit messier. Some SLs apply really complicated ways of measuring restrictions. One from 1984, 126 says no new structure shall be higher than the highest point on the existing property. Another one says nothing should be higher than 138 feet above mean sea level based on the 1972 post-quake adjustment. So that it's sort of inconsistent how they're applied. Very specific rules which require interpretation. I won't go into those. References to plans which might not be enforced anymore. There's one that says follow the Spenard Commercial District Development Strategy, which might not even be enforced. You know, we've had multiple plans after that. References to zoning districts that no longer exist. Some refer to R2. R2 was sort of subsumed by R2M at one point, but if you remember the public, you might not know that. And because an SL is a zone, to change it, you have to go through the full rezone process. So there's some SLs where they say, we're only allowed to have 30 units, we'd like to have 32, they have to go through the full rezone. There's another say, we'd like to add another use here, have to go through the full rezone. So a lot of SLs have been used to limit housing production, either by saying you can't have this type of use, or you simply cannot have this level of density. We're trying to figure out how many exactly that would be, and it's a big number. I mean, it's kind of speculative, you know, you're trying to guess what didn't happen, but it looks like it's somewhere in the thousands. But we're trying to tighten those numbers up, because right now it really is like, well, they could have had 20 dwellings per acre according to zoning at that time. They were limited to 10. How many might have been built that didn't? And we'll just never know. So this is just one page of these. I think we could probably find another page of just restrictions on density. Also, SLs do limit a lot of specific housing types. You see a lot of limitations on mobile homes. And it's interesting, right? You see limitations on things like mobile home parks along with things like mines or motorized sports or truck and equipment repair, right? Where mobile homes, they are just another type of housing, same with boarding and lodging houses. And there are some references to multifamily as well that I didn't have time to put on here. Finally, we talked to the Geotechnical Advisory Commission on November 26th. The recording is available. Really interesting conversation. They asked if GAC has ever been involved in the creation of SLs related to slope. We haven't found any evidence they have. That doesn't mean there isn't, right? It's going to take a lot of going back through minutes, but they weren't aware of this. They didn't seem like they had been included in the creation of these. And they recognize that, you know, some SLs are now covered by code, but didn't do a comprehensive analysis of whether or not the code, you know, the SLs are meeting some need. And they also talked about how many SLs were in seismic zones or avalanche zones. And we looked, and a lot of them are not in actually high seismic risk areas or avalanche areas. So finally, and I've said this kind of everywhere, is SLs have been a tool, and I've been kind of thinking of it as a release valve, right? You have a community meeting, or you have a rezone case or something, and you have somebody who's really trying to make something work. You have some concerns from the community. They've been a way to release pressure and sort of allow something to go through when there's opposition or support on one side. So, you know, they've obviously served a clear function. But in looking at it sort of the bigger picture, if, you know, why are we using SLs? Because in a regular land use system, a rezone should comply with the plan, and it either should be approved or shouldn't be approved, right? Adding these conditions or these sort of I don't want to say a contract, but these sort of stipulations onto it makes things a little bit complicated. So if property owners are putting forward rezones that are in line with the plan, but facing opposition, it might indicate, one, that maybe the plan doesn't actually reflect community needs. Or it might mean that you might need to revise the code. So when people do rezone, if there's some particular use people really don't like, that it's not bothering people so much anymore. On the other side of that, if property owners are putting forward rezones that require amendments to the 2040 land use plan or require special limitation to go through, maybe that change isn't appropriate for that area. Or maybe the 2040 land use plan is not reflecting the needs and the values of that area, and it needs to be amended. So I could go on for like this forever. I'll keep it at that. Any questions, we'd be glad to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Member Brawley has a question.
Yeah, thanks. Going back to the slide of SLs by decade, it looks like it's number 5. So you mentioned there's 79 that are unknown. And I understand, you know, we have our land use map and you can see them on the GIS, for example, and it just says SL. What is the character of those unknown ones? Do they just look like they're old, or is it that the records are lost? And I guess why I'm asking is because I'm concerned then that we have basically created unclear property rights for people by saying, yeah, we don't have the paperwork for why you have these restrictions, but you have some kind of unknown number of restrictions.
Yeah, through the chair, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in those cases, what we do is we look on the map, we write it down, and then we go up to the front where we have one big set of paper copies that at some point somebody printed all the SLs. So I think most of those are older. They're probably from the 70s or 80s. And then we're also going through the process of sort of getting those from the paper copies into the digital copies. But I found one, for example, and I think it's because it was 2. It was a 1979 SL, and it said you can't have any apartments in this area. It's an area in East Anchorage. And then it was amended in 1990 to say you can't have any of this, but you can now have churches and synagogues. So that's my first brush, but I'm thinking that I wonder if it's cases where there was an SL that was amended. And so, you know, you can understand when GIS is going through, like, well, this doesn't really fit as one or the other. But that's a sort of going to have to be a case-by-case basis. We've already started working on it, but basically it's printing out our map and then going up to the front and getting those paper records and then working with GIS to get those back in. But you're right, it's complicated to find some of these, even for us.
Yeah, thanks. And then just my one other question is, so because I remember the staff report had some examples from other cities really saying, like, you know, because what I found as a planner is that this is not a normal practice. It's maybe not unprecedented, but it's pretty unusual. So I just wondered if you have done any more investigation or found if this is more common or kind of what equivalents there are in other places.
Yeah, through the chair, we did find, so other cities in Anchorage or in Alaska have it, but it seems to be copied from Anchorage code. So Palmer has them, Fairbanks has them. Juneau doesn't have them. We wrote a number of cities. We heard from Great Falls, they don't have it. They just say we use a PUD. We wrote Boise. They said we used to do that through development agreements, but we're trying to move away from development agreements that are complicated to enforce. Reno said we don't have anything like special limitations. We accomplish similar goals via specific use standards, overlays, based zoning districts. Juneau doesn't. And I heard from one other city, I think it was Tacoma or Spokane, but you know, Tucson has them, but it's so difficult because every city might call it something different. But from the cities we've talked to so far, it doesn't seem like a widespread practice, or it seems like a practice that people might be moving away from.
Thanks.
Okay, Member Bronga.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to ask about the special limitation I'm sorry, I'm on a trail, so I'm breathing hard. SL10. I did a amendment to the home initiative because of the fire danger with single egress from those areas. And I'm worried that that protection, those SL10s were supposed to go through a review before more density. And I'm worried that this is going to mess with that. And I definitely am not in support of adding density to the hillside without addressing the single egress.
So I think I can answer that question if it's okay, Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
So
and you're next.
As I recall, Member Bronga, and planning, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong or jump in too, but as I recall, your amendment amended the R10 zone so that duplexes were not a by right use in that zone. They would have to go through a site plan review. So that process would still exist in code and would still be applicable. Your amendment was not via special limitation. And so I think that nothing would be undone there. And in fact, I did have legislative services because this is sort of on the same topic, I had Legislative Services circulate an email to all the assembly members. Email I received from Grant Matthews, who's at Triad Engineering, and he was saying that he has a developer that owns property on the hillside in R7, but historically that property has had an SL. And that what that SL does is it restricts the land use to single family homes only. Well, even before the home initiative passed in R7, duplexes were a permitted use. So this SL, not only does it go sort of, does it run contrary to the intent of the home initiative, but it's more restrictive than what was allowed even before the home initiative passed. And I think that's really interesting, the way that these have been used to limit residential density. I can also think of an example in Government Hill, where you have the west side of Government Hill is that more historic neighborhood, single family homes and duplexes, but then the east side has mid-rise apartments. Well, there was a project that was done, and I think it used some ACDA public money to put in a new neighborhood, and they kept the R3 zoning. And R3, as we all know, is supposed to be sort of that more middle density, multifamily, etc. So they kept the zoning, but they applied an SL that said that it could only be single family homes. There was a minimum square footage, and they all had to have 2-car garages. So you took East Government Hill, which historically has been multifamily, and made it more of this single family neighborhood, but without changing the underlying zone, just adding an SL to it. And so I think that is sort of the historic confusion that has been created by the application of these special limitations. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks. I did read that article, and it talked about an R7, which is different than I'm talking about R10. And I was pretty sure there were some SLs involved in that because of steep slopes, but I will double check. The other thing I wanted to comment on is in my neighborhood, Tougette's Foothills, there is an SL neighborhood that was specifically to make it more dense. There are little tiny homes sitting very close to each other, and they can't have a city plow because of the size of the road. So sometimes they can create more density with an SL.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Daniel, or I'll roll back to Daniel McKenna Foster?
Yeah, I mean, I guess going back to the home initiative, again, what the amendment that Karen brought forward and passed the body was to amend the table to remove the P for permanent use for duplex in the R10 zone and in its place put S, meaning requiring site plan review. The home initiative also at one point sought to make the slope considerations more universal than what is actually now in Title 21. And to Daniel McKenna Foster's point, I think that there are controls in Title 23 for slope as well. So as I understand it, I don't see any way that this legislation would run contrary to Member Bronga's amendment, which would still be in effect. Thanks.
Member Brawley had a question, but do you want to go first, or do you want me to roll back to Daniel McKenna Foster?
If you don't
No,
mind,
I think
I'll
I
jump
raised
in.
it.
I'm sorry, Member Brawley. I just wanted to jump in really quick to clarify one thing, that this AO, and perhaps Member Boland can correct me if I'm wrong, but this AO is not removing or changing any existing SLs. If it is passed, it would simply remove the ability to create new ones. So all of the SLs that exist in code today would still remain in effect. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about is just the fact that these SLs and the way they were created and the way they are removed, they technically have created a system where we have over 300 zoning districts in the city because of these SLs. So staff historically has not been a huge fan of these because they do complicate issues greatly. but we will still have those 300 zoning districts after this AO is passed. And at that point, the planning department would like to investigate potentially just finding out what those consist of, and if any of them maybe are duplicative of systems that we have in code now and maybe could be removed in the future. And that's
Dean, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, not really a question, but more of a comment. I just wanted to point out that in the Title 21 rewrite, they included a provision about special limitations in the transitional provisions section 210190B about special limitations. It talks about how if a special limitation conflicts with what the new Title 21 code rewrite did for zoning districts, how to interpret those. And I just wanted to just put that on the radar, but I don't know if it's very helpful, because I can see how having some old SL and then a conflict in the current code, even then you go through a cumbersome process to figure out what it all means. But I just wanted to provide the code site there.
Okay, member Boland.
Thank you. Yeah, I would just add on to what Melissa said. So I think the co-sponsors of this, myself and members Brawley and Zolotel, we're imagining this as sort of a phased project. And so as Melissa said, this ordinance that'll be before us on the 17th is simply to prohibit these as a practice going forward. And instead looking to the other tools that we have in code, which I think are valuable when it comes to these types of considerations, and also just to allow more zones to do what they're supposed to do by right. Phase 2 would be, okay, let's go back through all of these existing SLs and judge them on their merits. And really, I think the ones that we should retain are the ones that are truly protecting life, health, and safety, not the ones that are doing weird things like limiting residential density when we have a housing crisis, right? And so that will be future work going forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Member Boland. Did you have another question as well?
I do not.
Okay, Member Brawley.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess one big picture question to pose to the group really to think about is, how do we set property rights and how do we make land use decisions? And I think, the kind of standard way that we've been using and many places have used for over 100 years is zoning districts, uses, right? Really regulating in a consistent way. And I think kind of some folks have characterized special limitations as basically negotiating points with the community to say, if you want to make a change to your property, these are the things that the community is exacting from you. And so I want to put that out there as just something to think about as kind of maybe it's philosophical, but I do have a question because it does intersect again with property rights. And I wonder, not for answering right now, but either from planning or our legal folks, have there been legal challenges to special limitations? Because I think there's been discussions about whether they are takings, whether they are arbitrary and capricious, right? If they are spot zoning, all these things that are really not allowed and are big no-nos in land use law. And so, I'm not saying that is those things, but I am concerned that we have created a lot of legal risk for the city, especially as people have 40-year-old SLs that we, may or may not have a physical copy of handy, and creating that kind of legal risk. And so I just want to put that on the table too. And maybe that's something to follow up with Department of Law or Dean, if you have any offhand comments, but I am really concerned about the legal implications of what we already have in our code and what we've done for the last 40 years. Thanks.
Well, offhand, I don't recall actually some case law on it, but I would only be thinking if I had read Alaska Supreme Court opinions, but there might have been a bit of litigation over special limitations that were at the lower court level, that I hadn't heard of. I don't know. So that would be something to research, and perhaps there's something in the Department of Law's records. I don't know.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, this is Matthew Hurt, Legislative Counsel. There's not a lot in my research that I've been able to find, at least in the state of Alaska, challenging special limitations. It's because it's kind of a unique tool. There's really scant case law outside of the state as well. And even if there is, it might be called something different in another jurisdiction. So it's been difficult to find anything definitive. I will say that there's a lot of evolving thought around land use, particularly something like this. And there are some creative attorneys out there who are looking to challenge things like this as takings. And there is an evolving school of thought about what constitutes a taking. So I could see special limitations potentially being ripe for that kind of challenge in this sort of evolving legal landscape, but I can't point to any specific case.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I know we looked into that with the ordinance. Yeah, I just bring it up. So it sounds like it's really untested, but I just want to flag that I think there are some pretty serious potential legal implications if somebody really wanted to challenge it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Matthew and Dean, for the input, and Anna for the question. If there is anything else, any other comments on this, then we will move on to committee legislative and budget priorities. The annual list on page 2. Mandy, can you put that up on the screen? And actually, I see Daniel raised your hand if you want to go one more time.
Oh, sure. Thanks. So I guess I was just going to ask, because that is one thing Member Bronga brought up an example of perhaps where special limitations were allowed to increase residential density. And they're in a couple of the community comments that we've received and that are included in the staff memo. There seems to be this line of argument that suggests that special limitations are actually being used as special permissions and a way to achieve more permission with the property, but also have it comport with our adopted plans. And I guess my question would be for the planning department, as you look through these various SLs and the research that you've done, are those the exception to the norm, those ones that are sort of these negotiating tools to increase property permissions, or are special limitations more often being used as limitations? Do you have any sense of, how restrictive most of these limitations are?
Go ahead, Daniel.
So I think because they all vary so much, it's hard to give a good answer to that question. But they're just as an example of SLs that do actually increase density allowances. You could look at not a lot, but a few of the SLs on Hillside, in the Hillside area that where they were rezoned to R3, I think, in an area that had previously been a much lower density zone. And I think the purpose behind some of those was to allow smaller lot sizes and higher height allowances so that they could create a conservation subdivision, basically. And so these things were done in the past prior to there being a tool in code to create these conservation subdivisions, or a tool like PUDs that would allow smaller lot sizes. So, but they still retained a lot of the restrictions that of the previous zoning, and just used that rezone to R3 with an SL, and the SL was all the additional restrictions as well. So I think I've answered the question, or do you want to?
Yeah, I'm thinking in some of those, or it'll say, oh, it's a rezone to an R3, but then you're limited to single family homes. So, and you have to do a site plan review. So technically, yes, it is a more flexible zone, but if it's a more flexible zone with basically every use excluded and you have to do more processes, it's a question of, is it actually more flexible? And there are some that require a minimum density, but there are also, I think those in many cases are setting up a cluster subdivision, which is now in code, but there are also a lot that generally don't provide that flexibility. And then the bigger question, of course, is it appropriate to have an R3 zone in an area that every plan says is supposed to be lower density and not supposed to be R3? So then it really does stick out, in a place like Hillside where it says, the Hillside plan wants it to look like this and be like this. Maybe R3 isn't actually that appropriate. And then that gets into the question of, are SLs being used to sort of shoehorn in something for a very specific case when maybe it wasn't appropriate? And in our last memo to the planning and zoning, we say, look, it's okay. Sometimes rezones are not appropriate. If, just following what the plan says. If the plan says it's okay, terrific. But I guess it's complicated and it really does matter. It's kind of a case by case, I think.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, before we move on, I saw Elizabeth had raised her hand a while ago and I forgot to call on her. Did you still have a question?
No, I'm all right. I think Daniel covered it. This is the Elizabeth Appleby in current planning. I just wanted to clarify, I remember Braga had asked about the unknown ones. I just wanted to say that when people call current planning, we get a lot of the calls asking what the SLs are. We're still able to find them. It's more a matter we have to check a paper map at the counter, and if they're not in our digital system, that's all.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Appreciate the input. Okay, Mandy, if you can put the annual list back up on the screen, I think we can move on to that. Annual work plan and review topics. Alcohol and cannabis. I don't know, Member Brawley, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can, and then I'll probably throw it to Mandy because really she's the one that's been doing a lot of work on this. But there's two efforts to make some relatively small changes to alcohol code. We already made a lot of changes last year, addressing kind of some of the fines, I think it was, or fees, and then the marijuana code is a more comprehensive update. But I'm going to throw it over to Mandy if I can.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Mandy. Honest with the Municipal Clerk's Office. I have been working with Dee Ennis on doing a complete rewrite of our marijuana licensing code. So at this point, we are really pretty much done. We had introduced the draft AO at the previous CEDC meeting. So we were kind of waiting for comments from members or public or industry. And so now at this point, we're aiming to introduce the AO and have hearing before the second meeting in January. And we're aiming for this because we have one of our first applications for on-site consumption for edibles only. And so we're kind of trying to push it along so that the applicant doesn't have to comply with some weird provisions of code that are more applicable to inhalation. So that's where we're at now. So hopefully you all will see it soon.
Okay, perfect. Mandy, thank you. Economic development. Expand tax abatement, reinvest focus areas citywide, expand support for Anchorage creative economy, Music City. I think that's probably a member Martinez saying, and he's not on today unless somebody has comments on that. Establish Anchorage Metropolitan Area Projects Program with sales tax with AEDC. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on this. Okay, perfect. Moving along, community development, codify and confirm appointments to New Anchorage Child Care and Early Education Fund, Accountability Board, provide robust recommendations for marijuana tax revenue for early childhood education for fiscal year 2025 budget, and food security. I think Member Brawley.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that one you could actually mark as completed or take it off the list for 25. And then I would say like if maybe it's some ongoing monitoring of that, but that board is actively meeting now. So I think that one's considered complete.
Perfect. We will get that done. Housing activation, monitor HLB and real estate land disposals, potential housing development, vacant and abandoned properties, Anchorage Affordable Housing Land Trust pilot program, ACDA redevelopment initiative, federal funding application submitted. Does anybody have comments on that? Okay, 3 and 4-plex expansion, monitor recent code changes, residential zoning initiatives, home initiative, housing support pilot program, MOA and real estate. I think we pretty well covered that today. Continue to improve and simplify MOA process regulations on businesses, expedite permitting during peak season, look into the navigation program for building permits, create a catalog of pre-approved plans. Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, I'm not a sponsor on the pre-approved stuff, but I know member Zalatel and somebody else is working on that. And I think they're in process. So just to note that they ran into some issues to get that catalog done, but that's still in process.
Perfect. Thank you, Anna. Let's see. Expand public information, continued housing then versus now presentation title 21. Understand and address economic disparity in Anchorage, expand Cheers to Anchorage campaign, codify and confirm appointments, the Anchorage Child Care and Early Education Fund, accounting the board. We just discussed that with Anna. So I think we're good to go. Workforce recruiting and retention, comprehensive workforce needs study. Do you have a comment on that one? Okay, and then tourism. Next, we'll move on to audience participation, unless anybody has any additional comments they want to chime in with real quick. Okay, without audience participation, I will just say this meeting is going to be adjourned. Everybody drive safe today, and then I will see some of you in just a few minutes over at UAA. Thank you, everyone, for being on today.